The changing of the guard had just finished, the rhythmic stomp of boots fading into the background as tourists lingered behind the gates snapping photos of Buckingham Palace. King Charles stepped outside for a quiet stroll, a rare moment of solitude amid the endless obligations of his role. He wasn't looking for anything unusual, just fresh air, a moment to clear his thoughts, but then something caught his eye. A guard standing at his post near the palace entrance dropped something. A small battered notebook tumbled from his sleeve and landed on the cobblestone. It wasn't much worn at the edges, the kind of thing most people wouldn't notice, but Charles did. For a split second the guard hesitated, as if debating whether to break form and retrieve it. That's when Charles did something unexpected. He bent down and picked it up himself. Here, Charles said, extending the notebook back to the guard. The man stiffened, his grip firm as he took it back. Thank you, Your Majesty. His voice was steady, but something in his eyes flickered a split second of discomfort, maybe even embarrassment. Charles couldn't place why, but as he straightened up, his gaze lingered for just a second longer. That's when he noticed the guard's uniform. It wasn't right. It had the same red tunic, the same crisp lines, the same unmistakable presence, but up close something was off. The fabric looked worn, slightly faded, the cuffs weren't as sharp, and on the lower hem of his jacket, near the edge, was a faint stain. Charles studied the man's face, searching for an answer, but the guard had already returned to his post, eyes forward, posture rigid, like nothing had happened. Charles walked away, but the moment stuck with him. A royal guard's uniform should never be anything but immaculate. By the time he reached the palace doors, a thought had taken root in his mind, one he couldn't shake. Something was wrong with that man, and Charles was going to find out what. Back inside the palace, Charles couldn't shake the image of the guard, the hesitation, the faded uniform, the way he'd stiffened when their hands briefly touched. It wasn't just about a stain on a jacket, it was something deeper. Something was off. Later that evening, as he sat in his study, Charles casually brought it up to his senior aide. Sir Edward I had an odd moment earlier, Charles mused, swirling the tea in his cup. One of the guards, his uniform wasn't quite right, looked worn and dirty. Sir Edward, a man of routine and unwavering decorum, barely glanced up from his documents. They stand for hours, Your Majesty. Perhaps he's just due for a fresh set. Charles frowned. Perhaps, but he wasn't convinced. Royal guards were held to an impossibly high standard. Their uniforms weren't just outfits, they were symbols. They didn't fray, they didn't stain, and they certainly didn't look tired. Which guard was it? Edward asked, finally sensing the king persist. The one near the main gate. He dropped something. A notebook. Seemed uneasy when I handed it back. Edward nodded, making a small note. I'll have the commander check the duty roster, but that wasn't enough. Charles had spent his entire life watching people cover up things they didn't want him to see. He knew what quiet suffering looked like. I want a report, he said, setting his cup down. Not just his name, his record, his living situation. Everything. Edward hesitated for half a second, just long enough for Charles to catch it. Surely, Your Majesty, this isn't necessary. Do it. That was the end of the discussion. The request was discreet, passed down through the appropriate channels without fanfare. No one questioned the king's curiosity, not allowed, at least by morning. The report would be on his desk, buried beneath the usual briefings, and when Charles opened it, he would realize just how right his instincts had been. Something wasn't just off about that guard. Something was very, very wrong. The morning sun barely crept over Buckingham Palace when a thick folder landed on King Charles's desk. Marked confidential, it was supposed to be a routine personnel report. Dates of Service commendations, nothing out of the ordinary, but as Charles flipped through the pages his stomach tightened. This was anything but routine. The guard's name: Thomas Whitaker, served in the military. No disciplinary issues, commendations for excellent service, a textbook record, but at Buckingham Palace put on his uniform and stood motionless for hours, playing his part as if nothing was wrong. Charles closed the folder, his fingers pressing into the leather binding. He felt something he hadn't expected: anger. Not at Thomas, at the system that had let this happen. The monarchy prided itself on discipline, order, and tradition, but what good were those things if they failed the very people upholding them? How many others were in similar situations, quietly suffering while the world walked past them, assuming everything was fine? He thought back to yesterday, the hesitation when Thomas took the notebook, the faint shame in his eyes. The realization struck him hard. Thomas had been terrified Charles would notice, because if a king knew the truth, what? Then Charles stood, pushing back his chair with quiet force. His first instinct was immediate action. Find Thomas, demand answers, fix this now. But he stopped himself. This wasn't about charity, it was about dignity. If he stormed in like a ruler dispensing favors, it would only make Thomas feel smaller. No, this had to be handled carefully, respectfully. Taking a breath, he pressed a button on his desk. A secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. Your Majesty, arrange a private meeting, Charles said, with Thomas Whitaker today. A pause. The Royal Guard, Sir. Charles's voice was firm. Yes, and tell him he has nothing to worry about, because after today everything was about to change. By afternoon, Thomas Whitaker stood outside the private office inside Buckingham Palace, heart pounding in his chest. A Royal Guard never gets summoned like this. Had he done something wrong? Had someone reported him? He had been so careful, always arriving on time, always ensuring his uniform was as presentable as possible, but deep down he knew the truth. The king knew. The door opened and an aide gestured him inside. King Charles sat behind a grand wooden desk, but there was no formal stiffness to his posture, no air of judgment, just quiet observation. Thomas, is it? Charles asked, his voice calm. Yes, Your Majesty. A long pause, then Charles leaned forward slightly. I won't waste your time with formalities. I read your file. Thomas's stomach twisted, his hands clenched behind his back. An old habit from military training. Here it comes, the lecture, the dismissal. But instead Charles asked a simple question. Why didn't you tell anyone? Thomas hesitated. How was he supposed to answer that? How could he explain the sheer humiliation of it, that he, a man tasked with guarding the monarchy, couldn't even guard his own life from falling apart? I didn't want to be a burden, sir. His voice was steady, but his hands felt clammy. We trained to endure, to serve, no matter what. Charles studied him for a long moment, then, in a voice softer than expected, he said, but who serves you? Thomas. The words hit like a punch to the gut. No one had ever asked him that, not in the army, not in training, and certainly not here. I don't need special treatment, Thomas muttered, his throat tightening. I'll sort it out. Charles sighed, shaking his head. That's not the point. He folded his hands together. You took an oath to serve this institution, and I took an oath to serve the people under it. That includes you. Thomas swallowed hard, feeling something dangerously close to emotion creeping up his throat. He had spent months pretending everything was fine, holding it all together by sheer force of will, and now the king himself was offering to help. But Charles wasn't done. He sat back, his gaze unwavering. As of today, you will no longer be sleeping in your car. Thomas blinked, stunned. Sir, I've already arranged accommodations for you, Charles continued, and not just you. I've called for a full review of how we treat our service members. This won't happen again. Thomas could hardly process the words "a home support just." Buckingham Palace. Clutching a set of keys that hadn't been in his hands an hour ago, keys to a home. A real home. An aide escorted him outside, where a car was waiting. "We'll take you there now," the man said, as if this was all completely normal, as if it was just another routine errand. But for Thomas it was anything but. The car pulled up to a modest but comfortable apartment building in a quiet part of London. Nothing extravagant, but clean, safe. Thomas stepped inside the unit and just stood there. The air smelled fresh, like new beginnings. The furniture was simple but warm. A small kitchen, a couch, a bed. An actual bed, not the cramped back seat of his car. For months he had convinced himself he didn't need this, that he could tough it out, that asking for help was a weakness. But this wasn't charity. It was dignity. He placed his bag down carefully, as if afraid to disturb the space. His hands ran over the countertop. The light switched the edge of the neatly made bed, all his. Then on the small dining table he noticed a letter. It bore the royal seal. He swallowed hard, picked it up, and unfolded the crisp paper. "Thomas, you have spent your life serving others. It's time someone served you. Welcome home, Charles," are the words blurred as Thomas realized his eyes were wet. A royal guard wasn't supposed to cry, but at that moment, standing in his new home, holding a letter from the most powerful man in Britain, he let himself feel it. Because for the first time in a long time he wasn't just surviving, he was living. The next morning Thomas woke up in a real bed. For a few seconds he forgot where he was. The ceiling wasn't the roof of his car, the mattress wasn't stiff leather seats, the air wasn't cold. Then it hit him. It wasn't a dream. He sat up, rubbing his hands over his face, still trying to process everything. The king had given him a home. He wasn't just some invisible guard standing in formation anymore. He was seen. His uniform lay neatly over a chair, freshly laundered, pressed the way it was supposed to be. He ran his fingers over the crisp fabric, remembering how worn it had been just days ago. Today, when he returned to Buckingham Palace, he wouldn't just be a man trying to keep his life from falling apart. He would be a soldier standing tall again. As Thomas took his position outside the palace gates, he felt the difference immediately. His uniform was immaculate. His posture felt stronger, the weight on his shoulders not just the physical one, but the crushing exhaustion of survival was gone. Then something happened that almost made him break form. King Charles walked by. It wasn't unusual for the king to pass by the guards, but this time as he approached, something changed. One by one the other guards straightened just a little more. There was no official command, no spoken words, but they all knew they had heard. And as King Charles passed, something happened that had never occurred in all of Thomas's years of service. The king gave him a nod, not a grand gesture, not an announcement, just a simple, quiet acknowledgement. Thomas felt it in his bones. He had prepared his whole life to serve the crown, but he never expected the crown to serve him, and that was the shock of his life. If a king can recognize the struggles of one of his own guards and change his life overnight, what does that say about the power of simply noticing the people around us?